Hey guys, so we are starting a new unit and I wanted to record a video for you just so we could get through this set of notes. So we are starting our evolutionary theory, which is going to be chapter 16 in your book, in case obviously you need a book reference. In this unit, we'll be talking about natural selection, we'll be talking about Darwin, we'll be talking about a ton of the different theories. All right, so let's get moving. All right, so in terms of how the theory was developed, this is going to be chapter 16.1 of your notes. And then we are going to go through 16.2, and then I think we cover 16.3. So the first thing we want to talk about is how the whole theory was developed. What I'm going to be covering right now is going to be pages 375 to 379 in your book if you need a book reference. All right, so when we talk about biology, we're going to be focusing on evolution for this part of the unit. So evolution is going to be a process by which species change over time. So if you remember basically what a theory is, it is going to be a broad explanation that in some way has been scientifically tested and supported. Typically, it's supported within the scientific community. The modern evolution theory became when Darwin presented evidence about how evolution happened, and then he also offered an explanation of the mechanism behind how, or the process by which evolution happened, okay? So those are two things to maintain a theory. You need to come up with the mechanism of how it happened, and then you have to show evidence of why your theory is the correct one. So the first thing is Darwin's ideas came from experience. I'm sure that you guys remember hearing about the Beagle, which was a ship that Darwin was on, that he gathered a ton of information on all of his voyages that he took. So Darwin collected natural objects from the places that he visited. And here are some examples. So he collected some giant armadillo fossils from the coast of South America. Darwin also visited the Galapagos Island, where he collected several different finches that looked very similar, but they differed in beak size. And each beak seems suited for the finch's usual food, okay? So Darwin started to see that there was some sort of correlation between the beak size and what they were eating. So Darwin also made note that many of the island plants and animals were very similar, but they weren't absolutely identical to the plants that he saw in other places such as South America. So Darwin proposed that the Galapagos species had descended from South American species, but there had been something that had modified them over time, which is why they were similar to the plants and animals he saw in South America, but not identical, okay? And he determined that the modification over time and different groups have survived because they were eating different foods, and that's why the different modifications were maintained in the population. We refer to this today as descent with modification. When we talk about breeding and selection, Darwin also took an interest in the practice of breeding, kind of like Mendel. Through this interest, he gained some sort of new knowledge that breeders are going to take advantage of natural variation of traits within a species. This is known as artificial selection. This is the process of breeding animals or plants that have certain desired traits, okay? Also, Darwin was influenced by others. So when we talked about DNA, we talked about Watson and Crick. Watson and Crick never really developed any of their own methods. They basically looked at everybody else's research and then formulated some sort of answer. So Darwin, it's the same kind of thing. He did take input from those that are around him that were in his field that were doing research. So he was influenced by a ton of different fields, natural history, economics, geology. So I'm going to list a few of them that kind of fueled Darwin's invention of his theory. So we have Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. So he proposed that organisms change over time as they adapt to their environment, okay? The part where he got it wrong is he proposed that acquired traits are passed on to the offspring, okay? And we know, based on all the research that's been done, that Lamarck was incorrect about that part of his theory. When we talk about the other gentleman that influenced his thought, we're going to talk about Thomas Malthus. So he noticed that human population increased faster than the food supply, and it basically caused competition to survive. Darwin is the one that applied that idea to the fact that organisms are limited by their environment, right? We talked about that previously when we talked about carrying capacity and all of that in terms of population, and that there's some sort of limiting factor that causes the idea that a population can only get to a certain number, which is the carrying capacity. So Darwin was also influenced by Cuvier, Houghton, and Lyell. So they argue that fossil layers show differences in species over time, and that species from the past differed from those of the present. Darwin ended up applying that idea that species evolved gradually, and he got this information from these three gentlemen. Okay, so let's talk about, now that Darwin has all these ideas that he generated and he got from other people, let's talk about how we apply Darwin's ideas. So this is going to be chapter 16.2 of your notes. So let's get moving to the next part. Okay. The page reference is going to be page 380 to 385. I know some of you guys are still using your book that you have at home. So let's talk about evolution by natural selection. So Darwin proposed that individuals that have traits that are better suited for the environment are more likely to survive. Okay. Unlike Lamarck, who said that these acquired traits get passed down amongst the generation, Darwin proposed that the reason why they survive in the population or in the environment is because those traits make them better suited for the environment that they live in. Okay, so differences in these traits are due to natural selection. Darwin proposed that natural selection is going to be the cause of evolution. So Darwin's theory predicts that over time, there will be a number of individuals that carry traits that give them an advantage, okay? And then these traits are going to increase in the population. So let's talk about these steps. These are going to be some definitions. So we have overpopulation. That is basically populations will produce more offspring than can survive. We have variation. So we have inherited traits that are going to vary in a population. We have selection, which we've already talked about a little bit, having a particular trait that can make an individual more likely to survive than others. And then, of course, we have adaptation. So over time, those traits that improve survival and reproduction will become more common within the population. Okay, so here is just a graphic of steps to Darwin's theory. So the first one, like I said, is going to be overproduction. Then we have variation, then we have selection, and then we have adaptation, right? So although the species may have a larger population than can survive, please be aware that throughout all of these steps, we're going to be weeding out groups of the species. And then that means that the species that are going to survive and reproduce are the ones that are going to be better suited for the environment that they're in. Okay, so let's talk about selection and adaptation. So Darwin's theory explains why living things vary in form, yet seem to fit their environment. Each habitat is going to present some sort of unique challenge, meaning that it is only going to be in that particular habitat with that particular challenge. And of course, it's going to cause these challenges are going to give some opportunity for survival and reproduction, okay? Meaning that because of these unique challenges, there are going to be opportunities for certain species or certain members of the species to survive and reproduce. Each species has adapted. Now, basically, an adaptation is going to be an inherited trait that is present in the population, and it's present because that trait helps individuals survive in that particular environment. So Darwin said, okay, I have collected all of this data. I have talked to my fellow scientists, and now it's time for publication. So Darwin wrote an outline of his ideas about evolution and natural selection. And in 1858, which is almost 15 years after he wrote this outline, he received a letter from Alfred Russel Wallace, who had similar evidence. And then Darwin published the book that everybody knows today as The Origin of Species, where he presented this one explanation from data from multiple fields of science. Okay, so here is what Darwin explained. The first thing is going to be the fossil record. So the fossils are going to be traces of organisms that lived in the past. Sometimes comparing fossils and living beings reveals some sort of pattern of gradual change from the past to the present. For example, Darwin suggested that whales may have evolved from a mammal that lived on land. Okay, so Darwin took a lot of his research looking at all the different adaptations or the different developments that the species went through, and that's how he traced back where the whales came from. Okay, I will upload a video that definitely explains Darwin's thought, and it'll give you a better idea of what's going on, and I will make sure that I upload it into Teams. Okay, the other thing that Darwin explained is going to be this idea of biogeography. So this is going to be the study of locations of organisms around the world. Darwin saw similarities among 3 different species of large birds. He saw the birds on similar grassland habitats and separate continents, showing that similar environments shape the evolution of organisms in similar ways. So in other words, Darwin went to all these different places and all these different continents around the world, but what he was seeing was a constant trend. So depending on their environment, there were species that were in completely different locations around the world that were showing similar characteristics or traits that were shaped by the environment that they were in. Also the idea of embryology. So if you think about this, the ancestry of organisms is going to be evident in the way that multicellular organisms develop from embryos. And you can see that if you take a look at some of the pictures on the right side, we have the lizard, the tortoise, the pig, and the human. But if you take a look developmentally, it looks like the embryo develops in the same type of manner. Okay, obviously there are going to be some characteristics or some things that develop from the embryo that make it more suited for the type of animal that it is, but for the most part it was pretty consistent across the board. Okay, the other thing is going to be anatomy. So Darwin observed that by looking at the anatomy of both the fossil and the living vertebrates, this would support the hypothesis that all vertebrates descended from a common ancestor. Okay, so we have the human, the cat, the whale, and the bat. But if you look at all of the different species, they're all slightly shaped in a different way, but they all exist in all of the species, which lets us know that, you know, all vertebrates have developed from a common ancestor. All right, the other 2 things in terms of anatomy, we have homologous structure, meaning that there are organisms that have the same structure that have a different function, but then we also have analogous structure, which basically means that we have animals that have different structures, but they all have the same function. Okay, so the comparison that your book makes is going to be comparison to human in terms of the bat, right? So if I just talk about the human and the bat, right? We have the human that have the similar, and let me back up for a minute, that have similar parts, right? We have the humerus, we have the radius, we have the ulna, we have the carpals, we have the metacarpals, and we have the phalanges, okay? If we took a look at the bat wing, those 6 parts still exist in the bat, they just serve a different function, right? And that's because the bat is going to fly, right? So that's what they mean by if they have the same structure, but they have different functions, okay? All right, so the other thing that Darwin explained is going to be biochemistry. So Darwin compared DNA or amino acid sequences that show the same species are more genetically similar than others. Okay, this is going to be the end of 16.2. We are going to cover 16.3 at a later date. I hope that these notes were helpful. Please make sure that if you missed something that you go back and make sure that your notes are complete. These are going to be important for you to be successful on this evolution test. Okay? All right. Bye.